The Horse and the Farmer. A tale of unbreakable bonds. The sun cast a golden glow over the endless fields of Samuel Carter's farm. He was an old man, hardened by years of working the land, but his heart was soft for one creature, a wild mustang named Shadow. Shadow had wandered onto Samuel's land during a brutal storm, battered and scared. Instead of chasing the wild horse away, Samuel had left out food and water. Day by day, trust replaced fear, and soon Shadow chose to stay. One morning, disaster struck. Samuel's old truck refused to start, and with a storm brewing on the horizon, he had no way to reach town for supplies. The dirt roads would turn to mud, leaving him stranded. His only hope? Shadow. Samuel gently placed a saddle on the Mustang's back, though he had never tried to ride him before. Shadow snorted, uneasy, but as Samuel whispered, "I trust you, boy," the wild horse stood still. With a determined heart, Samuel climbed onto Shadow's back. The Mustang took off like lightning, galloping through the fields with a strength Samuel hadn't felt in years. They raced against the coming storm, the wind howling at their backs. Just before the downpour began, they reached town. Samuel grabbed supplies and patted Shadow's neck. The Mustang had proven himself a true partner. From that day forward, Samuel no longer called him Wild. Shadow was family. The rain poured down in heavy sheets as Samuel and Shadow made their way back home. The muddy roads were slick, but Shadow moved with precision, his powerful legs never faltering. Samuel clung to the Mustang's mane, feeling the bond between them strengthen with every stride. By the time they reached the farm, the storm had turned the land into a swamp of puddles and fallen branches. Samuel slid off Shadow's back, breathing heavily. He patted the horse's neck, his fingers tracing the damp fur. "You saved me, boy," Samuel whispered, his voice full of gratitude. Shadow nickered softly, as if he understood. A test of loyalty. The next morning, a knock echoed on Samuel's farmhouse door. When he opened it, a man in a pristine suit stood before him, a wealthy ranch owner named Clayton Briggs. "I hear you've tamed a wild mustang," Briggs said, his sharp eyes scanning the fields. "I'll pay top dollar for that horse." Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked at Shadow, grazing peacefully near the barn. He wasn't just a horse anymore. He was family. "He's not for sale," Samuel said firmly. Briggs smirked and pulled out a thick stack of cash. "Everyone has a price, old man." Samuel's hand curled into a fist. "Not me." Briggs scoffed and walked away, but his eyes gleamed with something dangerous. Samuel had a bad feeling. A midnight betrayal? That night, Samuel woke to Shadow's frantic whinnying. He rushed outside just in time to see two men in dark clothing struggling to lead Shadow away. The Mustang fought back, rearing up and kicking wildly. Samuel grabbed his old shotgun from the porch and fired a warning shot into the air. "Let him go!" he shouted. The thieves panicked, releasing Shadow before disappearing into the darkness. The Mustang bolted straight to Samuel, his nostrils flaring, his body trembling. "You're safe now, boy," Samuel whispered, running a hand over Shadow's mane. As dawn broke, Samuel knew one thing for certain. He would never let anyone take Shadow away, because some bonds are stronger than money. The price of freedom. Word spread fast in the small town. People whispered about how Samuel Carter had refused a fortune for his Mustang and how Clayton Briggs had sent men to steal him. But Samuel didn't care about town gossip. His only concern was keeping Shadow safe. One evening, while fixing the fence near the pasture, Samuel heard the sound of approaching hooves. Briggs had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. 4 ranch hands flanked him, each on horseback. Their eyes were cold, their grips firm on their reins. This wasn't a friendly visit. "I made you an offer," Briggs said, his voice smooth yet threatening. "I don't take no lightly." Samuel stood tall. "I don't sell family." Briggs smirked. "Then I'll make this real simple, Carter." He glanced at his men, who slowly spread out. "That Mustang isn't meant for a lonely old farmer. A horse like that belongs to a real ranch." Samuel's grip tightened around the hammer in his hand. "If you think you can take him, you're more foolish than I thought." Shadow, sensing the tension, snorted and stomped the ground, his wild instincts kicking in. The Mustang lowered his head, muscles coiling like a spring. Then, without warning, he charged. A Mustang's revenge. Shadow's speed was blinding. He barreled straight toward Briggs, forcing the man to yank his horse to the side in panic. One of Briggs's ranch hands tried to block Shadow's path, but the Mustang reared up and kicked, knocking the man clean off his horse. The others scrambled back, their own horses spooked by the Mustang's fury. Samuel didn't move. He knew Shadow was defending his home. Briggs's face turned red with rage. "You'll regret this, Carter," he spat, backing his horse away. "That Mustang will be mine one way or another." But as Briggs and his men rode off, Shadow trotted back to Samuel and nudged him gently, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Samuel smiled, running his fingers through Shadow's thick mane. "They don't understand, do they?" he murmured. Shadow whinnied softly, his eyes filled with trust. The legend of Shadow. From that day forward, no one dared to challenge Samuel and Shadow again. The townsfolk whispered about the Mustang that couldn't be tamed, the farmer who refused to sell him, and the bond between them that no amount of money could break. And every evening, as the sun set over the rolling fields, Samuel and Shadow rode together, free, unstoppable, and unbreakable. Because some things aren't meant to be owned. Some things are meant to run wild. And Shadow would run free forever, a Mustang's true home. Samuel knew the fight wasn't over. As long as Shadow stayed on his land, danger would always follow. Briggs wasn't the type to back down, and after the bounty hunters failed, he'd surely send more men. Men with guns, men without mercy. Samuel sat on his porch, staring at Shadow, who stood by the fence, his dark coat shimmering under the moonlight. The Mustang had become more than just a horse. He was family. But keeping him here meant keeping him in chains. The next morning, Samuel made the hardest decision of his life. With a heavy heart, he saddled his old mare and led Shadow toward the open plains, the last stretch of true wilderness where wild Mustangs still roamed. The journey was long, but Samuel didn't rush. He wanted to remember every moment, every step they took together. By midday, they reached the rolling hills where the wind whispered through the tall grass. Samuel dismounted, taking a deep breath before facing Shadow. "It ain't fair what the world's done to you, boy," he said, stroking the Mustang's forehead. "You ain't meant to be caged, and I won't let no man take that from you." Shadow stared at him, his deep brown eyes filled with something Samuel had never seen before. Understanding. Samuel stepped back. "Go on now. Run while you still can." For a moment, Shadow didn't move. He simply stood there, his ears flicking back, his muscles tense. Samuel almost thought he wouldn't leave. Then, in a sudden burst of power, Shadow reared up on his hind legs, letting out a piercing whinny. His front hooves crashed down, and in the next breath, he was gone. Samuel watched as Shadow galloped toward the horizon, his black mane flowing like a storm in the wind. He ran with the strength of the untamed, his spirit too wild to be owned. A tear rolled down Samuel's cheek, but he smiled. This was how it was meant to be. The legend of Shadow. Samuel returned home with an emptiness in his heart, but a fire in his soul. He had done right by Shadow. And though he never saw the Mustang again, stories spread through the town. Tales of a lone black stallion seen running under the moon, watching from the hills, forever free. Some swore that on the windiest nights, if you listened close enough, you could still hear his wild whinny echo across the fields. Because some spirits can never be tamed. Shadow was free, forever. A spirit that never left. Life on the farm was never the same after Shadow left. Samuel felt the silence in every corner of his land. No hoofbeats echoing in the morning, no watchful eyes following him as he worked. The fields felt bigger, emptier, as if a piece of his soul had galloped away with Shadow. But he never regretted his decision. He had set Shadow free. That was what mattered. Months passed, then years. Samuel grew older, his body slower, his hands rougher. But every sunset, he'd sit on his porch, gazing at the distant hills, wondering if Shadow was still out there. Then, one autumn evening, something changed. The return of the Mustang. Samuel was tending to his fields when he felt it. A shift in the air. The wind carried a sound he hadn't heard in years, a powerful, distant whinny. His heart pounded. He turned toward the hills, shading his eyes from the golden sun. And there, standing on the highest ridge, silhouetted against the sky, was Shadow. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The Mustang had returned, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, a small herd of wild horses stood tall and proud. Mustangs, strong, untamed, and free. Samuel took a slow step forward, disbelief and joy flooding his chest. Shadow. The black stallion let out a soft snort, his dark eyes locked on the old farmer. Then, he did something Samuel never expected. He took a step forward. Samuel stood frozen as Shadow slowly approached. The once wild Mustang, the horse who had fought so hard to be free, was choosing to come back. On his own terms. When Shadow finally reached him, he lowered his head, pressing his forehead against Samuel's chest. Samuel swallowed hard, running a trembling hand through the Mustang's thick mane. "You never forgot me, did you, boy?" Shadow let out a soft huff, his way of saying no. A legacy of freedom. Samuel didn't try to keep him. He didn't tie a rope, didn't lead him to the barn. Shadow wasn't his to own. Instead, he just stood there, enjoying the moment, the understanding between man and Mustang. And then, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Shadow turned and galloped back to his herd. Samuel watched until the last trace of his black mane disappeared into the wild. He smiled, his heart full. Some bonds can't be broken. Some spirits can't be tamed. And some legends, like Shadow, live on forever. Whispers of the wind. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel found himself looking toward the hills more often. He knew Shadow was out there, leading his herd, ruling the wildlands as he was always meant to. But deep down, he also knew. Shadow hadn't forgotten him. Some nights, when the wind howled through the fields, Samuel swore he could hear the distant thunder of hooves. The town still whispered about the black Mustang that roamed free, untouchable, a ghost of the land. But Samuel knew the truth. Shadow wasn't a ghost. He was watching. A time of change. Samuel's bones ached more these days. His hands, once strong enough to work the fields from dawn till dusk, now trembled when he gripped the railing of his porch. He wasn't young anymore. Time had caught up to him. One evening, as he sat in his rocking chair, staring at the sunset, he made a decision. It was time to let go. He had spent his life on this land, but it didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the future. So, he packed what little he needed, left a note for the town's young rancher, a good man who would take care of the farm, and saddled up his old mare one last time. There was only one place he needed to go before leaving for good: the final ride. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying the scent of the wild, the kind of crisp air that reminded him of freedom. Samuel rode slowly toward the hills, the same path he had taken the day he let Shadow go. He didn't expect to see the Mustang. Shadow was a legend now, an untamed king of the wild. But then he heard it. A single, piercing whinny. Samuel's heart stopped. He turned his gaze toward the ridge. And there, standing just as he had all those years ago, was Shadow. He was bigger, stronger, more magnificent than ever. His black coat shimmered under the rising sun, his mane flowing in the wind. The herd stood behind him, waiting. But Shadow wasn't moving. He was watching Samuel. A silent goodbye. Samuel swallowed hard, his vision blurring for the first time in years. He didn't have words for this moment. He simply took off his old hat, held it over his heart, and gave the slightest nod. Shadow stomped his hoof, as if he understood. Then, without another sound, the mighty Mustang turned, lifted his head to the wind, and galloped into the horizon, free, wild, and eternal. Samuel exhaled, his chest heavy and full all at once. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved Shadow, and in return, Shadow had saved him. Somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered a name: Shadow. And with one last glance at the wildlands, Samuel turned his horse and rode away, leaving behind a legend that would never die. Because some spirits run free forever. The story that never ends. Samuel never looked back as he rode away from the only home he had ever known, but he didn't need to. The land, the wind, the Mustangs, they would always be a part of him. Shadow had given him something no man, no money, and no land ever could: peace. He settled in a small cabin near a quiet river, far enough from town but close enough that he wasn't forgotten. Every so often, young ranchers and farmhands would visit, eager to hear about the man who had tamed a wild Mustang without ever breaking its spirit. They asked him, "Did you ever regret letting him go?" Samuel would simply smile, shake his head, and say, "Some things ain't meant to be owned. Shadow was never mine. I was his." The next generation. Years passed, and the town changed. The younger ranchers grew into men, raising families of their own. The land saw new fences, new barns, and new horses. But one thing never changed. On the farthest edge of the wildlands, where the hills met the sky, a lone black Mustang could still be seen from time to time. The legend of Shadow never faded. They told stories about him. The stallion who could outrun the wind, who never let a man ride him, except for one: the Mustang who chose his own path. The final ride. Samuel lived long enough to see his story become a legend. But one cold evening, under a sky full of stars, he knew his time was near. He didn't want to go in a bed, surrounded by walls. He had one last ride left in him. So, with hands that had aged but never weakened, he saddled his old mare one final time. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he was going. But the next morning, as the sun rose over the wild lands, a sight took the breath from the townsfolk. At the highest ridge, where the land met the sky, stood two figures, one man, one horse, Samuel and Shadow. For a long moment they stood side by side, just as they had in the beginning. Two souls, forever connected. And then they disappeared into the horizon, the spirit of the wild. Some say Samuel's body was never found. Others whisper that he became part of the land itself, running with Shadow through the endless fields. But no matter what version people told, one thing remained true. On quiet nights, when the wind howled across the hills, you could still hear it, the sound of galloping hooves, strong and untamed. And if you were lucky, just for a second, you might catch a glimpse of a black Mustang running under the moonlight. Because legends never die. And neither do the spirits that run wild. The whisper of hooves. The legend of Samuel and Shadow never faded. Travelers passing through the valley claimed to hear the distant echo of galloping hooves, even when no horse was in sight. Ranchers told stories around campfires about the black Mustang that roamed free, always watching from the hills, as if waiting for someone. But the old-timers, the ones who had known Samuel Carter, they never doubted the truth. He and Shadow were still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of men. The boy who believed. Years later, in a town that had all but forgotten the name Samuel Carter, a young boy named Eli found himself drawn to the wildlands. He was the grandson of a rancher, but his heart belonged to the untamed. While other kids played in the fields, Eli watched the hills, waiting. One evening, under a burning orange sky, he saw something move. A flash of black. His breath hitched. He had heard the stories. But could it be real? With careful steps, Eli climbed the ridge, heart pounding. And there, standing against the wind, was a magnificent black Mustang. Shadow. Or maybe his descendant. The stallion was older but just as powerful, his mane flowing like a river of ink. And when he turned to face Eli, the boy felt it deep in his soul, the same unbreakable spirit Samuel had once seen. A choice to make. Eli didn't move. He didn't reach for a rope or try to get closer. Instead, he whispered, "I won't try to tame you." Shadow stomped his hoof, watching, waiting. And then the Mustang turned and ran. Eli should have been disappointed, but instead he smiled. Because Shadow hadn't run away. He had run free. And just like Samuel, Eli understood. Some bonds aren't built on ownership. They're built on trust. A legend lives on. The town may have forgotten Samuel Carter, but the land never did. And for those who listen closely, who stand on the highest ridge under a full moon, the whispers still remain. The sound of galloping hooves, the call of the wind, the spirit of Shadow, wild, untamed, and eternal. Because some horses are meant to be free, and some legends never die.